including the seas around Australia. That's part of the Pacific Ocean. And therefore, there is no doubt that that sea is part of the Mutual Defense Treaty. And what is clearer, it's armed forces, public vessels, or aircraft in the Pacific. In other words, if a Philippine-owned vessel, aircraft or public vessel, or armed forces, meaning the marine detachment there, will become part of the conflict, then it will become part of the Mutual Defense Treaty, and we can invoke it. And that is part of the, you can see from the map of the U.S. Pacific Command, that it encompasses not only the entire Pacific Ocean, but also the Indian Ocean. That is the jurisdiction of the U.S. Pacific Command. The U.S. also, U.S. Senate also approved a resolution honoring our Mutual Defense Treaty, the U.S. Mutual Defense Treaty obligations. Then China issues an advisory through its China Daily, and this is now part of what I call the muscling and the bullying, and I quote the China Daily: "No matter how willing we are to discuss the issue, the current Philippine leadership is intent on pressing us into a corner where there is no other option left but the use of arms." I cannot imagine how the Philippines can press China into a corner, but of course, this is what we call an exaggeration.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, this is what you call a veiled threat through one of its spokesmen through the China Daily. And let me cite another news story.
Two Chinese warships and a hugely symbolic one for China, illustrating its growing naval might. These two vessels are said to be state-of-the-art additions to the Chinese Navy. They've just returned from a 5-month deployment to the Gulf of Aden, where they've been on anti-piracy duties. China's naval influence, of course, extending well into the Indian Ocean. But it's a stretch of water, the South China Sea, which is of much greater strategic interest right now as China vies for control of it with its Asian neighbours. At stake, of course, are said to be potentially huge oil reserves. So it looks set that there will be future spats, future confrontations with Asian navies, and also, of course, with the much more powerful United States Navy. China locked in a dispute with the Philippines at the moment over disputed islands in the South China Sea, but the leader of the task force here had this message for the Philippines government.
Hong Yan Island is and has always been Chinese territory. That is not negotiable. As for the Navy's role, we will follow whatever orders the central government gives us.
As a major port, Hong Kong is of course no stranger to Navy visits. The United States Pacific Fleet calls in here all the time. Its visits with its aircraft carriers involving far more ships and thousands more sailors. But it seems with China's growing military might, we're going to see more visits by Chinese warships here, by newer ships and by bigger ships in the future. Robert Bride, Al Jazeera, Hong Kong.
Of course, our Phil-Arms are also joining the fray by starting some demonstrations, not only in Chinese consulates, Chinese embassies, but also in various places where there's a big group of Filipino overseas workers. Now, I'm sure you're all familiar with the Winds of War by Herman Wouk. And if you look at all the news items that have followed this standoff in the Scarborough Shoal, this would read like Herman Wouk. But before that, I'd like to show you why it's not only a conflict that is limited to the South China Sea, but the repercussions could blow up not only within the South China Sea, but way beyond this particular territory. You can see that the South China Sea is almost dead center in this map. It is very close to Japan and Taiwan, and the South China Sea is a choke point as far as major sea lanes are concerned. About 200 ships pass through there. I understand that about 60% of the trade of Japan, especially oil, of South Korea, and of course also Taiwan, pass through these vital sea lanes along the South China Sea. And then beyond that, to the east, to the west, will be the Indian Ocean. And India would also want to have presence in the South China Sea, especially with the oil exploration potential in the South China Sea. So India is into the picture. Australia is also within the picture. In fact, they have a tie-up already with with, they have a treaty with the United States, and they have an agreement to station about 2,500 Marine troops in Australia. And of course, the obvious implication of that is that they can be used for a potential conflict in the area. Indonesia is the biggest country in the Southeast Asian area, in the ASEAN, and it is also very much involved. China's naval rise by Robert Kaplan in Stratford. What he's saying here is that the rise of China is a real rise, and it's something that cannot be underestimated. And then there's another headline, US-China on a collision course in the Asia-Pacific waters. Again, as I said, this reads like Herman Wouk in Winds of War. Another headline is Pentagon sends more warships in the Pacific. We've heard of this pivot to Asia. This is a new policy of President Obama, as articulated by both Secretary Clinton and then Defense Secretary Panetta, where 60% of the US Navy will be transferred to the Pacific area instead of the Middle East and Europe. And let's see a comparison of the China-US military balance. This was as of 2020. The US had a budget at that time of $729 billion compared to $78 billion for China, or about 10% only. But we have to remember that China's focus is in the South China Sea, and US has to handle a much bigger global area, so that $729 budget is spread around a much bigger area. Percent of GDP, 2% for China and 4.3% for the United States. Active personnel, 2.26 million, most of them land-based, and 1.5 million for the United States. Equipment, fighters, 1,320 for China and 2,379 for the United States. Stealth fighter, as of that time, 0 for China, although they're developing their own stealth fighters, and 139 for the United States. Aircraft carrier, 11 at that time, 0 for China, but they now have this Variag ship that is now an aircraft carrier, although it's not yet fully active. It takes about 10 years for an aircraft carrier to be fully operational.
What is stealth?
Stealth.
Sure.
Yung katago, parang when you're hiding from your wife. That's 65 submarines for China and 71 for the United States. 27 destroyers for China, 57 for the United States. In terms of nuclear warheads, this is where the wide disparity is. 240 for China and 9,400 for the United States. So in a nuclear exchange, China would not compare. Now let's look at the military spending. I showed you the 2010 figures, but a lot of people are saying that the way China's economy is growing and the way they've been spending on the military, there will come a time, and this will be sometime in the maybe about 20, 30 years from now, when China will be overtaking the military spending of the United States, as shown by this chart. I picked this up from the book Mega Changes 2050, citing some articles from The Economist. So you can see that by 2035 and 2050, I think a lot of us will still be around during that time. We will see that China will be overtaking, that is the projection. Then some more news, like a lot of movement going on. US submarines dock at Subic. Then in the Washington Post, they came out with this very startling news article from the Pentagon. Stealth destroyer at over $3 billion apiece is US Navy's latest answer to rising China, and they talked about its capability, particularly the rail gun, which is going to be state of the art. It is almost like a sci-fi article, but it's true. It's already being built. And then the statements from Senator Levin, McCain, and Webb on the CSIS report where they're supportive of this move on the part of the Department of Defense and Department of State. Vietnam slams absurd China protest over the islands because China is also protesting. Anti-China protesters take to the streets of Hanoi. This is what I find very impressive about Vietnam, because they're really protesting. They're coming out But here in the Philippines, our reaction has been very mild. There are more action about the Tubataha Reef, unfortunately, than against China. I cannot understand why. So you see the demonstrators happening in Vietnam. Panetta sends message to China during historic visit to Vietnam. Japan enters the picture. Japan steps up the South China Sea plate. With China on mind, India, Japan, South Korea hold trilateral. Japan and China scramble aircraft for the first time. This is a very recent news, and this is why a lot of people find this a very hairy possibility. I was talking with Joey earlier, and he projects, if I may quote Joey, that maybe the conflict is going to be between China and Japan does not have a small armed forces capability. It can put up a good fight against China. In fact, Japan's Air Force is considered one of the top 10 in the world, even better than the Chinese Air Force. Maritime talks in Japan. Foreign Minister's visit to China. As soon as Abe took over, he immediately sent his foreign minister to the Philippines to talk about the security situation. And you can see that now alliances are being formed. Australia urges UN Law of the Sea approach to the South China Sea claims in support of our claim. But immediately China warns on US-Australian ties. Now India is getting involved in the China-Philippines territorial conflict. I don't know, I see a lot of Indian names in this, in your club. Dargani,
Matani,
yes, Dargani, Otamjandani. So we have a lot of, I don't know where you will be in case of a conflict. And China, India, look at India is having a show of force showing their capability. Indian warships to sail through South China Sea. India prepares to counter China's glut with INS Satputra. This is a stealth frigate of China. They think that this is the answer to the destroyers and frigates of China in the South China Sea. By the way, India has a very big navy also. In fact, they've had an aircraft carrier capability for quite a long time now. One of about 11 or 12 countries in the world with aircraft carrier capability. India, Indonesia back freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, and this statement can be construed as supportive of our claim and the U.S. position, because the U.S. position stresses freedom of navigation. Anything that violates freedom of navigation in the South China Sea would trigger a response from the U.S. Navy. Malaysia hails America's move as timely. And then, of course, China upped the ante by setting up their newest city and raises the threat of conflict in the South China Sea. What is this? This is Sansha. This is their city hall or provincial capital in the middle, in the Paracels area, and they're garrisoning this with about 10,000 troops. China takes the glove off. This is the headline when they announced the Sansha initiative on their part. China to formally garrison disputed South China Sea. Has the South China Sea reached boiling point? You can see that the crescendo is rising. And then, of course, they also intervened in the recent summit meeting of ASEAN, where they prevented the ASEAN from coming out with a formal statement, where the statement was supposed to be for a stronger delineation of responsibilities as far as the South China Sea is concerned. At that time, the chairman of the ASEAN was Cambodia, and a lot of people thought at that time that Cambodia was being manipulated and controlled by China. And then the Philippines hits China's duplicity in the West Philippine Sea. ASEAN talks fail over China dispute because of the intervention of China. Of course, our response, we're starting to build up also. Philippine Navy buying 2 Italian warships, so we are into this arms race. I don't know how far we'll be, but better something than nothing. Philippines to bid out disputed South China Sea oil gas blocks. This is what a lot of people are thinking, that a lot of this is all about oil, about natural resources, but of course there's also the military significance of controlling a very vital sea lane in case of global conflict. Where is China taking Asia? China sends first ocean-going patrol vessel to the South China Sea, and again, a show of force on the part of China. This is very recent, where they showed the Chinese frigates and destroyers conducting sea exercises in the South China Sea, and some people are saying that they even entered the Philippine waters. They passed through Taiwan and Batanes, the so-called Bashi Channel, and that's very close to Philippine territory. China's newest and deadliest warship has entered the South China Sea. Philippines initiates legal act versus China and territorial row. This is what I mentioned at the start of my speech. And a sea of troubles. This is an article from Time magazine, which I find a little troubling, because now they're starting to compare Asia today with the situation in Europe before World War II. People are familiar with the First World War, are familiar with the Balkans, with the convergence of so many forces like Austria, Germany, France, Russia, England, and then later the United States, that blew up into the First World War. And let me quote some noted statesmen, former Australian Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Kevin Rudd. Like the Balkans a century ago, driven by overlapping alliances, loyalties and hatreds, the strategic environment in East Asia is complex. At least 6 states or political entities are engaged in territorial disputes with China, 3 of which are close strategic partners of the United States. Another quote from the former South Korean Foreign Minister Yoon Yang-kwan. Back then, Great Britain's relative power was in decline, while Germany's had been rising since unification in 1871. Similarly, at least in terms of economic capability, the United States and Japan seem to have begun a process of decline relative to China. Major power shifts define areas in which key political leaders are likely to make serious foreign policy mistakes. Poor management of international relations at such critical junctures has often led to major wars. And Lee Kuan Yew also spoke about the situation, and I quote him, "Will an industrialized and strong China be as benign to Southeast Asia as the US has been since 1945? Singapore is not sure. Neighboring nations are uneasy that China may want to resume the imperial status it had in earlier centuries." And this is quite foreboding, coming from a noted intellectual leader like Lee Kuan Yew. And of course, the Department of Foreign Affairs statement on China's response to the Philippine arbitration. And I do hope that what we are seeing are just not saber-rattling, because it can be very tricky. Saber-rattling can be very tricky from the military point of view, because it could trigger the real thing. But we are just hoping that these are just diplomatic posturings, and in the end this will be settled diplomatically. That is the hope and prayer of this representation, and I think that should be our hope and prayer also, because we are not just close to the conflict, we are within the potential conflict area, a flashpoint that has been considered a flashpoint from way back, but now it's really heating up. On that note, I'd like to thank you for inviting me. Maraming salamat sa inyo. Thank you so much.
Meron dyan, no?